In this video, you'll learn all of the audio settings and what they do, leaving no questions left. So let's get started. Something to note, if you don't change your device from your primary sound driver to an ASIO driver, you won't be able to record. Our primary sound drivers will generally be the slowest option with the most latency, and changing our driver changes a lot of things. So if you're on a primary sound driver, I recommend that you switch to an ASIO driver. Even if you aren't recording, you can use something like ASIO for All or FL Studio ASIO, and this will help improve performance. Now, what ASIO drivers are is they're basically the kings of routing audio, which is why you need to use an ASIO driver to record. If I switch to an ASIO for All, then you'll see a bunch of input and output options. And if I open FL Studio ASIO, you will see one input and one output. Underneath, we have info like our status. If something's wrong, you'll see in red here, it might say disabled. For us, we see open. It has your sample rate that's being worked at, inputs, outputs, all kinds of cool stuff. We also have our overall latency here in milliseconds. This latency here is generally already compensated for by FL Studio. However, it is something you'll hear when actually recording. This latency is a huge topic that we'll continue to talk about as we go. To the right, we have auto close. Auto close pretty much decides whether FL Studio's exclusive or not to the audio driver, meaning that the audio driver is going to lock to FL Studio or not. If you ever notice, you go to YouTube or something while FL Studio is open and the YouTube video is not playing audio, it's because of this. If you turn on auto close, then when you go to a different screen, it'll auto close FL Studio out from the audio driver and use the audio driver on the next program that's in focus. And this is if your audio driver is not multi-channel. If you're using bridged plugins and you don't have a multi-channel driver, I advise you make sure that auto close is not on, because bridged plugins act like their own Windows software being open, which means anytime that you are trying to use that VST plugin or instrument, it'll take the audio driver from FL Studio. And you can see how that might cause some problems. Up top right, we have sample rate. Human hearing goes up to 20 kilohertz. So in order to cover the range of human hearing, you would think you need 20 kilohertz. Well, that is not correct. In order to sample that, you need to be able to get points in between. And in order to do that, your sample rate has to be at least 2 times the highest audible frequency, which is why Drake gets those underwater sounds from his producer by downsampling, because downsampling makes it so it's not possible to recreate frequencies above a specific frequency range. So if we look at our sample rate, 44.1 is a standard because it's double 20 kilohertz, but that's the concept you need to understand. So all you need is 44.1. If you want to work in 48, you can. 48 actually became a standard because of video and movies. And then also, if you ever need to downsample, you can do so. Do keep in mind that working in 48 actually requires more information to be processed. So working in 44.1 will help with processing when it comes to the workload on your computer. Coming down to this button here, this is going to give us our ASIO panels that we've already looked at. Something we didn't talk about, though, is buffer length, which you're also going to see on your primary sound driver and other sound drivers. Buffer length is the amount of time you're giving FL Studio to process data before playback. So at 40 milliseconds, from when I click play to when I get audio back to me, there's going to be a 40 millisecond gap. Or from when I have my microphone and I speak into it to when I hear it back to me, or when I have Midi keyboard, play the keys, to when it plays back to me, there's going to be a 40 millisecond gap. Our buffer length here will increase or decrease our latency. Now, the goal, of course, is to get the latency down as much as possible, but your CPU can only handle so much. So what you want to do is you want to make sure mix in buffer switch is off. And you want to move your buffer length as low as possible without getting these underruns. So with mix in buffer switch, basically it's processing as close as it can to the actual audio driver or the hardware that's being used. The buffer switch is what calls for audio from FL Studio to play on the device that we have chosen up here. The reason I said turn this off while setting your buffer length is because we're outside FL Studio, we're no longer at this underrun counter. We are bypassing that. So if you're having underruns, you will not see your underruns actually counted. You'll just hear it back as crackling, crappy audio. So this is a great option if you have hardware that can actually handle the workload. However, be wary when turning that on of what it actually does. Next, we have triple buffer. And what triple buffer is going to do, even though it says triple, is it's going to actually double the latency caused by your buffer length that you chose in your driver. Specifically, if I have 11 milliseconds of 512 samples, then when I click triple buffer, it's going to actually double that 11 and become 22 milliseconds. So with that being said, before I click triple buffer, I can assume that we're going to go from 40 milliseconds to 50. So they must be rounding up for this 11 or something else is going on, but basically double. We're adding our buffer length back on top to create extra time to avoid underruns and make sure we're processing our audio completely and fully. So if your goal is to reduce latency, make sure triple buffer's off. But where triple buffer is great for is if you're mixing, your project's all done, and you're in that mixer and you need that extra processing power to get by, triple buffer is going to save you. So if we look at our primary sound driver here instead of an ASIO driver, we've got the buffer length we've talked about, and we have this offset option here. Now, based off the FL Studio manual, this offset option seemed to be only applicable to Windows Vista and would help with performance somehow. However, based on reading the FL Studio manual, I'm not quite sure how. Generally, offsets are going to have to do with latency, but whatever. We have use polling. This is supposed to decrease buffer size without increasing underruns. However, on some computers, it may do the opposite. Use hardware buffer is kind of like our mix and buffer switch option that we spoke about earlier. It's going to push the workload off to the hardware rather than do it in FL Studio. Next, we have use 32-bit buffer. I want you to notice in our status, 16-bit stereo. If I click that, 32-bit stereo. So this is going to increase the quality of the audio that we're processing on our sound driver, but this will also increase the workload, which can make your latency worse and give you more underruns. So the way to think of 16-bit versus 32-bit is, let's say I've got a ruler that's about this long, can't change the length of the ruler. And in 16-bit, we're only going to have the inches up to the top. However, in 32-bit, we're going to have every inch and half inch up to the top. And each inch or half inch, we can place a point of data. And so with that being said, you can see we have double the amount of data in our 32-bit than we do our 16-bit. I don't know if it's actually double. I don't know the computer science behind it. However, that is the basic concept that you need to understand in order to tell the difference. Now, underneath, we're going to have priority. You can think of priority as like how twacked out your computer is. So with a high priority, your computer is freaking wired. There's more CPU dedicated to processing and handling high workloads. However, the downside to this is that the crashes are just as hard. So if your FL Studio is running hard and crashing a lot, then you'll want to turn your priority down to kind of stop it from crashing and see if you can fix the workload in other areas in your audio settings. If you can't fix the workload in other areas in your audio settings, then leave it on highest priority because that'll give you the most bang for your buck. However, you are going to still have a lot of crashes. If we change this and we went to normal priority, for example, then our CPU is going to chill out. Now, if we start having our underruns count up here, instead of it freaking out and being like, oh my God, there's an underrun and it crashing, you're going to start having underruns. You're going to hear that audio crackling and popping, and your CPU is going to just, it's fine. Your CPU doesn't care. So set your priority accordingly. Now, next we have safe overloads. What safe overloads does is safe overloads is going to keep the tiniest bit of processing power available for your graphics user interface. And it does this so that when you get those high CPU spikes and moments of stress, that there's a tiny bit left to keep the graphics interface going so you don't get a full-on FL Studio lockup, crash, freeze, whatever you want to call the situation. So I recommend keeping safe overloads on just in case, because it really doesn't take much from your processing power. It takes just enough for you not to freaking crash the program anyways. What are you going to get back by having it off? A crashed program? Who cares? Turn it on. We've got our playback tracking. What playback tracking is going to do is it's going to choose what to base FL Studio's playhead and other tracking information off of. So if your playhead's still on bar 1 and you're hearing audio from bar 3, this is what it has to do with. Now, we've got 3 different options. We have mixer, driver, and hybrid. Mixer is going to base it off of FL Studio. If you're using an audio interface and it's not right, this can be your problem. You'll want to switch to driver. Driver is going to use, your driver. So if I am using an interface, I want it to be there. However, if I'm not using an interface and it's on driver, that can be the source of my problem. And the last choice, hybrid, is a mix of both. I'm not sure exactly how this works, but it goes FL Studio saying it's here, our driver is saying it's here, so we're going to put the playhead here. So last ditch effort, go to hybrid, see what happens. Now, in case you're still having issues, they have this cool offset option, which is going to let you move the playhead more one direction or the other. Now, this offset is not just for visuals. This offset is also going to affect the placement of recorded notes. If you want a little bit more clarity, you can go to the FL Studio user manual. So if you're having issues with latency when playing Midi and things like that, I'd suggest you set up record mode and you try and play as on time as possible with a metronome or something to keep timing. And you do it like zeroing in some sites. If it's too far to the right, then you move the latency to adjust the other direction until you get it so close that it's just can't get any better. You're right there. Now, before we do this, however, there's other reasons that your MIDI might be off. If you go to our quantizing options here, this is global snap to grid / quantizing options. Anything we choose down here, it will snap anything we record to that note or to that grid. If I want a quarter beat and it's on bar, you better bet we're not getting any quarter beats. We're only getting bars when we record, which is a problem. None, cell, and line have no quantization effects on the notes we play. So if that's set to anything besides none, cell, or line, then understand you're going to get that quantizing situation. If you're having latency issues with vocals, come to your mixer, go to your drop down. You're going to go to disk recording, make sure latency compensation is checked. And what that does is our audio settings here, it automatically compensates for this 50 milliseconds of latency or 11 milliseconds of latency or whatever the problem is when you're recording. Something important I didn't actually say about underruns before is if you see this underrun counter go up, but you don't hear it, you're fine because you won't have those underruns in the rendered file. So if you need your buffer length a little bit shorter, just that extra little bit to fight that latency, as long as you're not hearing those underruns, good on you. Jumping down to our CPU section, we've got multi-threaded generator processing and multi-threaded mixer processing. What multi-threading is breaking up your CPU cores into virtual cores to increase the speed of processing. So this is a good way to increase plugin performance without really any loss at all. And they have it broken into two sections, which is generator, which is going to be things like instruments, and mixer, which is going to be things like mixer effects. Something to note that a lot of people don't know, but you should know, is if you're having plugin issues for either a generating plugin or a mixer plugin, they might not like these settings. So if you come in here, turn it off real quick to troubleshoot, and all of a sudden your plugin is working correctly, you know that's the problem. But you don't have to give up the advantage of multi-thread processing. What you then do is you'd come into the back of your plugin, go processing, and you have an allow threaded processing option. Turn it off, and just turn it back on in your audio settings. And now that plugin specifically will no longer use threaded processing, and it should autosave. If not, check this autosave button or click save manually, and it should load every single time with your threaded processing off, and then you can just freaking forget about it. Back to audio settings. Next thing we have is Smart Disable. Smart Disable, I recommend always having this on. Just because you have it on doesn't mean it's on in the plugins. Again, this is the global setting, so the back of each plugin is going to have an option for this. What Smart Disable does is it makes it so that when a plugin's not being used, you can shut it off so it's not using any processing power. If you have a large project with a lot of effects and it's really bogging you down, you can actually go Tools, Macros, and switch Smart Disable for all plugins, which will turn it on for all plugins so you don't have to turn it on in the back of them. Issue. Something like Melodyne, if you click record in Melodyne, it's going to count the beats until you start singing, but not if Smart Disable is on. If Smart Disable is on, it won't start until you start singing and it starts using the plugin, which means you can start singing on beat 16, but now your vocals are always going to play on beat 1. That's a problem. The good news after the bad news, because I like you guys. The solution. If I was to go to my mixer here and open a plugin, we'll go to the back, processing, allow Smart Disable. If we turn that off, it should save, just like the allow threaded processing. And now it's never a problem for us again. Also, if you want to leave allow Smart Disable on, but you just don't want it Smart Disabled, you can click the drop down in the top left, and there's a Smart Disable option here that you can turn on or off. This is where it's actually going to be turned on or off. This button just says, hey, I allow it or I don't allow it. Next, we have align tick lengths. What tick lengths are is it's like the smallest amount of time used for processing. In the FL Studio manual, they actually reference PPQ, which is pulses per quarter note. If you want to know more about that, that is in project settings. Go watch my video above on that. Now, because align tick lengths has to do with the smallest amount of time used for processing, I don't actually know whether it uses PPQ or uses sample rate or uses both. But this is actually a troubleshooting, problem solving button for VSTs and other plugins that might be having issues with rendered audio timing errors, where that plugin and its instrument or whatever might actually make it out of time with the rest of the beat or song, instrumental, whatever, solves high CPU loads, random things like that. So if you're having plugin issues, just flip that on, see if it fixes it. If it does, good on you. If it doesn't, I'll be releasing a plugin issues video here pretty soon. But for now, that's what we're looking at. We have resampling quality. You got linear, Hermite, sync, low quality, average quality, high quality. And this defaults at 24-point sync. Basically, what this is for is resampling, or when you actually change the pitch of a sample. If you're really stretching out or hardcore pitching a sample, you're generally going to get an issue called aliasing. I'll link a video about that from FL Studio down below. Again, it's another one of those things where I don't know the exact science, but it creates artifacts and issues that can affect what you're hearing in a way that you might not want. 24-point sync is usually enough. 32-point sync is what I go for because it's a little bit better. 64-point sync would probably make sure you never hear those issues. But every time that we're increasing that resampling quality, we're increasing how much the CPU actually needs to process at one moment in time. So you might want to opt to keep it lower. Next, we have Preview Mixer Track. And what Preview Mixer Track is actually going to do is it's going to take all those random FL Studio noises, it'll take the metronome and whatever else and shove it out to a mixer track. So I chose, I don't know, let's say track 4 because it's right there. Turn on the metronome. There we go. I can record and flip the FL Studio metronome if I want to. Back to audio settings. Play truncated notes on transport. Truncated means shortened in duration or extent. So if we put MIDI notes in the playlist here and we put our playhead somewhere over the middle, this is considered truncated. If we click play, we get nothing. If play truncated notes on transport is on, it now plays them. Next option we have is reset plugins on transport. Basically what this does is every single time that we're going to play this, clicking our transport controls, FL Studio is going to resynchronize with the plugins, making sure that we have the correct timing when it comes to the FL Studio plugin relationship. If you have this turned off, it'll make the play and stop buttons and all of that more responsive, and there will be less processing time required. However, the trade-off is you might get those inconsistencies with your plugins and the timing, which sometimes can be a problem. And underneath is nothing. So now that we've ran through all of that, that's about it. We have our input-out device options, which is going to have to do with our drivers and choices related to those drivers. We have our CPU section, which is going to be a place we're going to look to solve potential plugin issues, as well as increase performance. And then we have our mixer section, which is going to do the same thing. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask below. I hope this video was helpful. And if you like this video, please like this video. Again, have any comments, please comment. I always appreciate a subscribe. It's Warren with Scale Audio. Adios.